Good evening everyone. I'm Nicholas Brash, Director of the Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that the land we are on always was, always will be Indigenous land, and I pay my respect to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. Tonight is our first live book club event for the year, and I'm delighted to be welcoming one of our organisation's absolute favourite writers and thinkers, Arnold Zable. I'm glad that we've restricted ourselves to just his latest book, The Watermill, because otherwise we could be here for hours talking about his novels, his non-fiction book, his essays, his activism, and just about anything else, because he's a man who knows about just about everything. As a book club event, we will be inviting your questions from the very beginning. So please post them in the Q&A section that you'll find near the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. However, please note, obviously, that we get more questions than we can ask. Navigating Arnold and your questions tonight is our very own Tali, Lavi. So over to you, Tali. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We just seem to have lost Arnold for a moment.
He's back, so I'll hand it over to you.
Teasing us. Good evening, everyone. And it gives me great pleasure to sit in the virtual company of one of this country's finest treasures, Arnold Zable. I'm refraining from referring to Arnold as a literary treasure, because that would indicate that he is confined to the sphere of literature, even though it is a significant and wonderful sphere and he has done much to contribute to it. Arnold cannot be contained. I do not mean this because he is a formidable storyteller, even though this is true. It is also true that Arnold is like many of the Luftmensch he writes about. He is not rooted to any one particular geography or nation. He is a citizen of the world, his community, that of humanity. He is indefatigable in his work championing the rights of refugees and persecuted writers around the world. To speak of his writing is to have to speak about all of these things. Arnold is an extraordinary spinner of tales, both fiction and non-fiction. In his hands, they breathe, they morph into dibbooks and golems and exquisite poetic songs that make us weep or sigh or breathe with relief. His published works include Jewels and Ashes, Wanderers and Dreamers, Café Scheherazade, The Fig Tree, Scraps of Heaven, Sea of Many Returns, Violin Lessons, and The Fighter. Each is precious. Each is a window unto the human condition. Arnold has written plays and is a teacher. He is an honorary fellow at the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. And I found out from his website that Arnold has conducted writing workshops throughout Australia and abroad and worked with refugees, immigrants, the homeless, the profoundly deaf, Black Saturday bushfire survivors, problem gamblers, and other groups, using writing as a means of self-understanding and healing. And it would be remiss of me if I did not mention one other thing before we dive into this elegant, profoundly affecting artwork of a book, The Watermill. If one was working on a dictionary entry and searching for sentences to connote usage and context for a better understanding of the word at hand, I could think of no better example for the word mensch than the following. Writer, storyteller, and humanist Arnold Zable is a profound mensch. That would suffice. So Arnold, thank you for being here and for being our mensch.
Oh, thank you for that extraordinary introduction.
You make it easy. But I'm not going to embarrass you by leaving you on that note. I'd love to firstly return to Nick's acknowledgement of country, because here we sit. I am on land whose traditional owners are the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, you on land whose traditional owners are the Wurundjeri, and in where we meet, the last movement of this symphonic work, The Watermill, which I should point out is non-fiction, There is a weaving of these stories that sit at the heart of this country. These stories that pulsate, even if sometimes we, the newcomers, and by that I mean even if we be several generations back or one generation or not even born here, even if we are oblivious to these stories, in where we meet, there seems to be a letting in, a turning towards this knowledge, these narratives. Can you tell us a bit about this, Arnold?
I think there's a key line in that story, which comes up a couple of times, that he or they, it could be my father, my mother, could be anyone that's come here in the last 2 centuries. Unfortunately, not enough though. And that line is, came from the old world to the new, only to discover it's far more ancient than the old. I think that's the great paradox of living in this country. You know, for my parents, this was a haven, a refuge, a new world. And for quite a few of the characters I write about in that last story, Australia was a haven. And yet at the same time, there is something else here that's ancient. And this, I think, is what we are striving for. When I say where we meet, you know, this somehow, it's got something to do with this. For us to really mature as a nation, it's got something to do with understanding this old world to the new, only to discover it's far more ancient than the old.
In your acknowledgements, you actually, you do write that it is to Auntie Joy Murphy Wandon, Wurundjeri Elder, and to Zara Shohani. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how this relationship with Auntie Joy began.
Well, it's interesting. You're the first interviewer to begin with the last story, and it's kind of lovely that you have. It's a story that brings all the other themes together in some ways. But look, I had just finished Jewels and Ashes in 1990, came out in 1991, and then I began wondering about a grand mystery. You know, why is it that this city where I'd gone through 16 years of schooling, if we count my Bachelor of Honours degree, learnt and read many histories, this was home. Why is it that I did not even ever hear the word Wurundjeri or Boonwurrung or Kulin Nation? You know, back in the 1990s, if you would have stopped anyone in the street, out of 1,000 people, you would have been lucky to find one to know that. Things have changed a lot in the last 30 years. And so I did a workshop with the wonderful founder of the Koori Heritage Trust, Jim Berg, and all kinds of things happening, including me coming upon a map. He showed us a map of Victoria dated 1835 to 1853. And I'd seen a map like that before on the outskirts of Treblinka. You know, it was a massacre map. And I think there were over 60 sites of massacre here in Victoria. It was a map of Victoria. And beneath was written, many more died beyond prying eyes. Look, I said to Jim, look, how do I find out more? He said, go and meet Auntie Joy. So about 3 weeks later, I drove up to Healesville and knock on this weatherboard house that from which you can see from the veranda the Great Dividing Range. And Auntie Joy opened the door, and she opened the door into 50,000 years, maybe more, of history. And that was a moment of transformation for me. And this began my journey with her into territory that transformed the way I see this city.
Mm. Let's turn to the image of the Watermill, which is the name of the first movement of your book, as well as the book itself. The image of it churning and turning as it does in the rural Guizhou province in southwest China. And it feels as if this echoes humanity's turns of fortune. A stone carver says, and you quote him, humans will always lose their way, come to their senses and lose their way again. In the ballad of Kio Narom, which is the second section of the book, you write of the eponymous Kio, the word healing is too trite. Narom had survived, but it was a matter of luck. Can you tell us a little bit about this sense of continual change, of flux between the worst and the best parts of humanity?
Yeah, look, this is our lives. All our lives is a roller coaster. And the sooner we learn to accept it, the better. But these stories are right, of course, the steep ascents and descents, they're much more acute. And I guess let's take the first story, Huaxi, the watermill, which was actually Huaxi Watermill, a place where I spent 10 months in 1984, 85, working in this remote province in Guizhou. And it was an amazing time to be in China, especially in this remote province. I was one of the first few Westerners that had come there for decades, because China had just emerged from the Cultural Revolution. In a way, if you want to sum up the Cultural Revolution, it's the whole country went mad. In a way, the whole country went crazy, led by a Pied Piper, another old man that wanted to cling to power. There's a lot of them around. And but there was this kind of beautiful moment, a kind of interregnum between the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976 and then the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And in that moment, China just opened up, and I was there, and I was welcomed inside. And people would come to me. My students were agricultural scientists and language teachers, aged between the age of 18 and 70, my students were. And they would come to me and tell me these extraordinary stories about what had happened to them during the Cultural Revolution. They came late at night. There was still a certain kind of wariness when people told these stories. And so I was plunged, thrown into this. But then if you take the bigger picture, if you step back, China is a dynastic system. And, the whole history of China is a rise and fall of dynasties, of empires within that space they call the Middle Kingdom. And what really struck me about China, and in a way is the heart of this story, I think, the thing that surprised me is not the ups and downs so much as what had endured. The classical, almost every person I met, they knew Li Bai and Ru Fu, the great Tang Dynasty poets, or Han Shan, Cold Mountain, who becomes a part of the story, an anarchic, crazy poet, going back to about 7th, 8th century. They still revered the four treasures of the study: the ink, the inkstand, the brush, and parchment. There was still a connection to something ancient and far grander than this rise and fall of dynasties. Yes, I think that was so I became part of the rhythm of all of that. I was taken by the rhythm of it. And as you know, that whole story, as you've just pointed out, revolves around a watermill where I'd go every evening and I'd just sit with the miller, and you'd hear the thum, thum, thum of the watermill going round and round, and the peasants would come down from the mountains and the paddies and the surrounding villages with their grain, and the miller would sit there with his long stem pipe, and he'd make me a cup of tea on his pot-bellied stove. I mean, that's a photo of the mill on the front cover of the book. That's an actual photograph of it. And I guess just sitting there, we didn't say much to each other. He couldn't speak any English, and I had a very little Chinese, but somehow we were present, and it was a real conversation going on. In fact, as you know, towards the end of that story, I take one of my students down to the watermill, and I say to him, "Look, to my student as translator, I said, tell the miller that I'm going to leave in a few weeks, and I want to thank him for all the times I've spent here. And he said, we'll tell the Waigwaren, which means the foreigner, literally the outside person, tell the Waigwaren, I want him to write a couplet. You know, this ancient, once again, this ancient form where you had a heading and one vertical line and another vertical line. It's like a haiku. And you'd place them above the door and one side and the other side of the door. And he said, I want you to write a couplet that sums up our many conversations. And there was more to the watermill than meets the eye. So that was the challenge. And as you know, and it's interesting. I think it's not really giving it away because it's so much at the heart and the essence of what I'm trying to say. And your question too, I went away thinking a couplet. I could write a whole book about this extraordinary time I've spent here. But then, and every word counts. And it came to me. I come from a distant place to Huashi Watermill. So the heading was obvious, Huashi Watermill. So one side, I come from a distant place to Huashi Watermill. And then the other side, here I feel at peace, my mind becomes still. But I was debating, and this is how it is with haiku. What should I have? My mind becomes still or my heart becomes still? And I decided on mine, but when Kanchi, or I've actually said his actual name, but when the student, which I'm reluctant to do, but when the student of mine, who I call N in the story, when he, wrote the calligraphy, translation of that couplet, he pointed out that the character for heart and mind that he was using are one and the same. Those are the moments when a kind of door opens and you cross a bridge through language, actually, into another way of seeing, as well as touching upon something that is, a kind of common humanity.
Let's go to that exact moment, Arnold, when you talk about writing this couplet, and I'm going to quote you here. You write, and I saw that you're really struggling with it, right? As anyone would be. How do you distill the essence of all these episodes and interactions and your relationship with the country and so on? And so you write, and I saw the limits of words, of language as a futile attempt to encapsulate lived experience and doomed to a kind of failure. And I wanted to know if you feel this is intensified by the genre of nonfiction, that when writing fiction, there is something inherently freeing in its ability to become something else entirely.
This is a very, very important question. And in fact, for me, always the borderline between fiction and non-fiction has been very thin. And this is especially the case out of the 4 stories in this first story, Huashi Watermill. And what I mean to say is, fiction actually derives from the Latin fictio, which means to make or to shape. It's actually the way you tell a story. Originally, it goes back to, 2 sisters, couple brothers, siblings in particular, living in the same family will tell totally different stories, and so on and so forth. Witnesses to the same event will have different accounts, and each one will think that their story is true. There's that, but there's something else too. Whether I write fiction or non-fiction, I rely on the art of scene construction. I construct scenes, so the poetic, the rhythmic, as well as the visual, what I call painting with words, is there. But in that particular story, I also do something else, partly because I wanted to hide the identities of people, and partly also because it's something that released me to tell a bigger story. I create monikers and composite characters. I did this in Cafe Scheherazade, right? I had composite characters, and so that I could encapsulate in a particular character a number of characters and points of view. And so, as you know, there's the wine monster, and there's the old boatman of 100-Flower Lake, and there's the Beijing man, and there is the little gentleman. I had a lot of fun with that. So the stories are all true, but there was a way of kind of conflating them so that I could tell a bigger story. And so I released myself. And I always have a kind of conversation with my publisher afterwards where I I say, well, look, really, I usually in the author's note, I point out what, as I have on this occasion, what I'm actually doing there. And there are one or two composite characters in the Ballad of Keo in the Rom too, the second story set in Cambodia, like the angry young man that features in the story is a composite of a couple of young writers that I worked with there 5-6 years ago. So there is that as well. But going back to the issue of words that do justice to a situation, and this is what writers grapple with and battle with all the time, whether they're writing fiction or non-fiction. And of course, there are different challenges in those two genres, but nevertheless, how you capture this, how you capture the extraordinary experience, for example, of being with a woman who's lost 4 children to the Cambodian genocide. How do you encapsulate, and I think there are ways, and we may discuss that, but how do you encapsulate the magic of being here in this valley among the mountains of southwest China for a year, and I was there alone most of the time as a Westerner. How do you encapsulate the magic and the grandeur of this experience? I mean, that's always the challenge for a writer. But of course, when it comes to certain things such as writing about trauma, then the challenge becomes even deeper still. Yeah.
Before we go to trauma and maybe stories, I'd like you to tell us about not the idea, but how walking becomes integral. Well, I feel like it is the way you see the world. It's part of the way you see the world. It allows you this perspective on landscape and people. And I wondered if it's also a kind of restorative measure for you, because you experience a lot in this flooding of stories, wherever you are, and we'll talk about that maybe a bit later as well, what it is to be a listener. But maybe if you can tell us about what it is to walk and how that forms this kind of image throughout your work.
Well, I've always been a walker. And when I was younger, I was a runner, it was mine. But I've always been a walker. Even last night, I helped my son and his partner shift to a place they're now living in. And I just went out and I walked around. I wanted to see, I wanted to get a feeling of this new neighborhood they had come to. And I pick up on things. And there's something about being in movement, alone, in solitude, that perspective. It's interesting. Things come your way. Things approach you as you walk, and there's a kind of magic. The magic to walking is this, really. It's that there is a 3-part movement to what happens. Like someone will be coming towards you, right? So that's the birth of something, right? Or something. It could be the watermill, right? And then it's there, and you may spend 5 minutes talking, or a couple of hours sitting in this particular place, or a couple of hours, whatever, by that river, and then you'll move on, and that's the 3rd movement. It's gone, and the next thing approaches. And there's something very magical about this. It's about, and that's the way I see stories as happening. They unfold, they come, and then they go. Very much so. This is the case throughout this book, as you know. The stories, I approach stories, or they approach me, and then you move on. So it's a wonderful question, actually, this question of movement. And also the other thing is there is an acute sense of an alertness of what is happening around oneself, whether one is walking or whether one's sitting in a room, in a living room, talking with someone, a conversation, or, as you know, there are many different places where conversations take place and the stories come out of in this particular book. And that is, if you're alert, you'll see the things that are over there a little bit, on the periphery of vision. And very often that's the important thing, the thing that's on the periphery of vision. So yeah, walking is a big part of my passion for life, I guess. And from that, a lot of my work evolves.
I think it's interesting you say on the periphery of vision, because I think also, for many writers, it is being on the periphery itself. So it's that embodied sense of being on the periphery of society, of what's happening, to be able to view it as well. So there's both kind of angles coming at different.
Yeah. Look, it's interesting that when you're writing a book like this, say, there is an interesting shift that takes place between two states. One is the witness state, right? So that's the state I prefer to be in. The story's not about me. I'm the conduit for stories, right? And my job is to listen and then to transform these stories somehow, but also to honor the person that's telling the story. And but then sometimes it is about you. So you shift from the first person, say, as witness, to the first person as subject. And you have to step forward. And there are moments in the book when I just have to say, yes, the light is on me, whether I like it or not. I have to step in here. I'm a participant, not just an observer, but I prefer to go back to that stance of the observer. And of course, in a novel, you can just write points of view. Different points of view. In Scraps of Heaven, my novel set in Carlton, I'm Josh. I become the character Josh, and it allows me to just see many points of view. But in this sort of story, you're shifting all the time between being a witness and a subject.
This is a good question. It's just come in, and it's also going to link to what I'm going to give it a two-part. So it's an anonymous attendee. I can't tell you who wrote it. Mm-hmm. He or she asks, or they ask, how long did it take you to write The Watermill? What is your process for writing a book? And I might also add to that, Arnold, to ask, did you take journals whilst you were in China, or some other way? Was there another way that you wrote to kind of, so that you would look back on those writings from 1983, was it? 83?
Well, 84, 85, yeah.
84, yeah. So I'll leave you with that question.
Yeah, well, look, it's a good question. I keep journals. And if I didn't, I couldn't have the detail or the texture that you need to make these stories come alive. And they have the power of immediacy. So that's a big part of it, that I'm able to go to those journals, and then once I'm in the journals, it's not only what I've written there and what I've observed, but then you bring to it many other things. You can do follow-up research. You can I call it interrogate the story in various ways, but and it's interesting. But nevertheless, you have to make choices. I didn't want to just publish my journals. I wanted to frame stories, and I wanted to zero in on what I felt was the essence and the heart of what was happening back then. And we've spoken about this a bit already, about how I zeroed in on the endurance of the classical and other themes in just about all the stories. So yeah, look, without the journals, that's I don't think that it would be as textured as it is, and also, but there are things that do stand out. And when you write about them, they become magnified with the passing of years. For example, the Renoir painting in that apartment in Guiyang City, and here I am sitting. And this is this thing about you have to be aware. So you're sitting in this little apartment with this extraordinary old couple that has survived so much and endured so much, the Cultural Revolution and many other things. And on the wall there's a Renoir painting. And when you go into that painting, you start to see something extraordinary. There is a story to that. And once again, it's being alert to all of these things around you is very, very important. And and some of those things will be in the journal, but when you rework them, you discover a new truth about them. And you go to that painting, right? And you work from it. And as you work from it, something else emerges. I love that process.
I think it's also really interesting because those journals are from the 80s and you're writing this movement. So when did you, maybe I'll ask you before we go into that, when did you begin to curate this book, to shape it, to know that you were going to thread these stories together?
Well, going back to that original question that you've just from the how long did it take me to write this book and these stories? It's almost impossible to answer because in a way there were the journals I wrote all those years ago, so that was part of the work. But I guess it was about a 2-year project in between many other things that that I do, and there was a lot of work. There's a lot of work in this book because it's informed by history, but the history is like a big iceberg beneath the water, and the story is just that part that emerges, and it had to be informed by history. I had to know my history, and I had to find an elegant way of working it into the characters in the story so that the story would not be overwhelmed. It would be very easy in these stories to be overwhelmed by the history too. So it's a delicate process. Look, this is what it is. You write the first line. One thing I'd say here, your questions are very interesting. In a way, they're about the process. And for me, the process of writing is I follow the story. I enter into it, and then I let the story lead me. And sometimes it leads me to totally unexpected places. They're not pre-planned. It's just that, okay, I want to write the story. I sort of knew it'd be around the Watermill in that instance. And where will it take me? But the story where this happens most dramatically is the story about Sonia Lizaron, the woman who formed a theatre in Bergen-Belsen, or co-founded a theatre in Bergen-Belsen, that happened to have been, when she was alive, my son's surrogate grandmother. Wonderful Sonia Lizaron, extraordinary story. In that story, I entered into it, visiting her in the old age home, but I'd already known her for decades, and then moving from there, and it took me to totally unexpected places. And whilst I was engaged with it, unexpected things happened, and I learned more about her that I'd never known before.
Let's actually speak about that section, Arnold, because the Republic of the Stateless is just unfathomable in so many ways, the story itself. It seems to me that it feels like the role of art post-trauma feels that it's most extreme here in terms of the theatre that was created during and immediately after the Shoah. And I thought maybe you can tell us a bit about Sonia Lizaron and Sami Feder's work in the theatre and what they did in the Composite Theatre and also in other concentration camps.
Well, it's very interesting because I want to begin with something that continues the other thread of this conversation, the art itself, the art and the craft. And I want to begin with a gesture. You know, one of the things that I'm alert to is gesture. Like Kyo Narom, when she told her devastating stories, her fingers were like this. You know, in her fingers you could see ancient Cambodia. You know, when you go to Angkor Wat, you see on the friezes on those extraordinary temples, you see the asparas, the celestial dancers, and it's there. Be alert to this. I never write about victims. I write about human beings, and to write about them, you have to be utterly alert to them, and that includes not only what they're saying, but these gestures and the silences. All of that is part of the story, and so with Sonia, the gesture was this: that whenever you approached those times, and she was one of the most modest women I've ever met. Such an extraordinary story she had to tell, and such a courage and artistry that was part of her life in the darkest of times. But when you approached her those times, she'd go like this. She'd close her eyes and rub her knuckles, you know, because she wanted to leave the past behind at a certain point. The story had been told from her point of view. She'd done what she'd done, which was to form this, co-found this extraordinary theatre in Bergen-Belsen, where they held up a mirror. They held up a mirror to what they'd all experienced. You know, I'll read you one paragraph, because this is the opening night of the theatre. It was formed in 1945, and Sammy Feder was the artistic director and the driving force, and later on married Sonia. So they were totally different. Sonia at a certain point wanted to move on, whereas Sammy just could never leave it. That period between 1933, when he was learning to be a theatre director and playwright and journalist in Berlin, through to 1948, when the theatre was disbanded, he just reworked it for the rest of his life. To the age of, then he died about the age of 90. So it's partly about that. It's partly about, and I think it drove them apart in the end. That she was forward looking, he was backward looking. But on the premiere night, they performed in a tent. This tent was used by the Nazis to train their officers. They had people like Goering and Goebbels speaking. Here they are in this filter that fitted 1,000 people, but on this night there were 3,000, and they were clamoring to get in. They were so desperate to see their lives reenacted on the stage. And I'll just read you this particular paragraph. You know, the response of the audience was immediate and visceral. Many wept throughout the production. Some screamed and shouted. Others became hysterical. The performers and the audience were barely indistinguishable. They formed a single entity in their expression of loss and grief, offering it up as if in sacrifice to the gods of theatre. The space was reminiscent of the amphitheatres of ancient Greece, returning drama to its origins as a ritual of communal release and exorcism. And this is what it was. They were creating scripts that, without compromise, was reworking what had happened to them. And that was their artistry, that was their courage. And until recently, it was a little known story. And here's this modest, unassuming woman who, she went on to become a singer. She actually performed at the Kadima decades ago on an international tour. And, you know, there are many movements in her life: Paris, New York, and finally Melbourne, where she lived in Elwood those final few decades. But as you know, in that story, something happens. There is a twist. There is a telling of the story, which I'd already written It was published in Meanjin. But then when I entered into it, as I said before, the story took me somewhere else. And I got a phone call from Israel, from Ari and Olevsky, and later on spoke to his sister. And they told me things about Sonia I'd never known before, which totally changed the way I saw her and saw their relationship. And there's a moment in that story where I say, you know, fate is very fragile. Stories are fragile. The fragility of that story, you know, Elie Wiesel, I think it was, said, there are stories meant to be told, and not to tell them is to betray them. Most of the stories in this book are driven by that impulse, right? These stories came my way, or I went through the mountains and there I was, and they came my way, and I'm compelled to story, but I've got to do them justice. You know, and otherwise I'm betraying that. So there's another form of betrayal. So you're betraying them if you don't tell them, but you betray them if you don't do them justice. And that, in that story, more than any story I think I've ever written, I was conscious all the time as I was piecing together the fragments that I've got to get it right. And getting it right means that it's not over romanticized, sentimentalized, you know, that there is a hardness there, the hardness of that reality, not shirking away from some of the horrors, but on the other hand, not seeing the light, the beauty of what they achieved, and the light and the beauty in Sonia in particular. So yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. At the end of that story, I say, you know, yes, there are stories meant to be told. Sonia and Sammy, I hope I have not betrayed you. And then I write, the thought is unbearable. The thought is unbearable. So I still carried it right through to the end, that sense I've got to get it right.
Yes, that story, well, all of them really affected me deeply, but I think it was the notion that, you know, as they're just being liberated, they're collecting testimony. Even at that moment of liberation, for some of them, it is an absolute imperative to collect testimony, and and that image of the exorcism, as you say, is excruciating if you have some kind of relationship to the Shoah, you know what they, or you know a smidgen of what they went through and how they carried it afterwards. To think that they sat there or didn't quite sit there, it feels like this completely embodied reaction to having this, as you say, a mirror in front of them.
And it's very, like, I go back to this thing, and this is in all my work. Cafe Scheherazade is about crazy characters, right? They're alive human beings, and they have different responses to what has happened to them. You know, and this is very important. Do not reduce people. Do not reduce them. Cafe Scheherazade is a character. You know, good bastard. What do you know? You know, they're coming at you in this Yiddish storytelling way as they sit in a cafe. And the same here. It's not only the story, but the way it's told and what you. And then you start to see the full humanity of someone. That is very, very important. They are, in their way, they are authors. What do I mean by this? It's only recently, as I did the Black Saturday Bushfire project, that it occurred to me as I was listening to their stories, which I weave in some of them briefly in the final story where we meet. It occurred to me, well, one of them said to me, one of the participants on the workshops came up to me and said, Arnold, this is more profound for me than when I was running workshops with them, more profound than counseling. And I said, why? He says, because when I am telling my story, I'm in charge. And then I realized, oh, yes, this is what author must mean. An author is an authority. It's got something to do with the word authority. And who is the person who is an authority on what it is to go through whatever, a bushfire or that experience that Sonia went through, or Kieran or Rom in Cambodia, or those people I got to know and love in China. Who's the biggest? And of course, here in Arnie Joy and the other Indigenous elders that I met and travelled with around this extraordinary city of ours. Who's the biggest authority on all of this, if not the people who've experienced it and lived it and gone through it?
Arnold, can we talk a bit about the idea of story? And because it's a highly polyphonic novel, as you can hear, whoever has not actually read it, you can hear from what Arnold's saying. You have stories coming at you, and yet you still manage to make it very elegant and distilled. But I wanted to speak about story in terms of the weight of it, the weight and the liberating force of retelling the story. So there's the weight of the experience of outliving genocide in Australia, in Europe, in Cambodia, in Iraq, or cultural oppression in China. And this sense that to tell the story liberates them somehow. And I'm not going so far as to say that it repairs the affected person to a pre-traumatic state, but it offers the possibility of entering into a different stage that allows not a full healing, but something to occur that that is, perhaps it is moving forward, as in Sonia, but for Sammy, actually retelling the story was to sit within it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I make no judgments.
Yeah.
I don't say that Sammy's response or Sonia's response was I just tell the story, and they were both valid responses. And Sammy was driven to the point of obsession to this extraordinary thing took place, and I've got to tell that story and honor every single actor in that troupe and every theatre worker and the people that came to me, and this is what we did. And he wrote 4 memoirs, big memoirs, right? Whilst because he shifted to Israel, Sonia went to New York when they separated.
Arnold, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Just in regards to that, the memoirs, were they written in Yiddish, and did you translate them, or have they been translated in any?
There may be one that's been translated, but the others are in Yiddish. So it's very handy knowing the Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish is a glorious language. And my parents and the people I grew up with, the Bundes and the secular Yiddish school I went to in Carlton, they gave me a gift. They gave me a magic key, and I was able to find things that I would never have otherwise been able to find. So Yiddish is very, very important, and language in general. So even the story set in Cambodia and China. And even the Wurundjeri story set here in Melbourne, I mean, bits of language leap out at you. It's not the Yarra River, it's the Birrarung, which means river of mists. River of mists. That's something else. That's something else altogether. And it's as I say, that moment in the Watermill. It's not only mind, but it's also heart. But yeah, the language is a very, very important part of it. And but yeah, I guess the issue is, once again, how do you do justice to something? How do you do justice to a story? And first comes that intent listening. And that listening, as I said, involves many things. It's listening also to, going back to the question about walking in nature, it's also listening to the environment, listening to everything that's happening around you.
So there's that sense of, yes, them sitting with the story and then you sitting with it. And this actually brings me to a question that I wanted to ask for Marg Brenner, trumped me. And
Mark Brenner.
yes, dear Mark, you were with us tonight. I know she's going to be very embarrassed to have been named, but she wants to know in the final story where we meet that you've interwoven the threads of a few stories, each heartbreaking in their own individual way. She writes, how difficult was it to write these pieces into one story? And furthermore, I'm going to add that question to that question because they are heartbreaking. I want you also to maybe tell us how you carry the emotional weight of these stories. So first, how difficult was to write those pieces together? And then how do you carry the emotional weight of them?
Well, I decided this was the way I have to tell a story, because where do we meet? So there are three threads: the thread of my own experience as a child growing up in a house of absences and ghosts and invisible maps. And then there is the story of my journeys with Arnie Joy. And then there's also that thread of Faraz Shahani, who survived the Civex disaster, where he lost his wife and his daughter to the ocean. And at a certain point, I decided, look, I've got to do it this way. And I don't think technically I would have been able to do it even 10 years ago. You just learn and grow as a writer. You learn the art of weaving, and it's a delicate art. And there are moments when all the threads come together, and there are moments when they separate again. And so that story was, it's one of the shorter ones at 13,000 words, right? And yet I think it was the one that took the longest to write because of it. How do you carry the weight of a story? Well, look, it began as a child. As a child, I had to learn to sit with trauma. And my mother was very disturbed by she was a beautiful woman. She used to be a performer, a singer. Song is so important to me, but because I heard my mum singing incessantly the Yiddish songs she once performed before the war, but she was very, very damaged by what had happened to her family. Different people react differently. My father lost his family, but he had a very different, he says, I get up in the morning. He used to say he was a Yiddish poet. Now I get up in the morning and whatever I dream, I throw my dreams into the rubbish bin, But my mum was stuck there, and there was all kinds of, the characters of fear in fiction gets the closest to my mum, anything in Scraps of Heaven to my mum than anything I've ever written. There I could really let go. But the character, Josh, who's partly based on me, he's always running out into the street to get away from this. But then there's something compelling about this person with the gypsy black eyes. So you're running back in. And so at a certain point, I realized that to be with her, and I wanted to be with her, I had to accept who she was. I had to just learn to sit with her, both in those moments when she was radiant and those moments when she descended into this spiral down into this dark, paranoid world full of rage and sorrow. And then she'd emerge again. This movement, which I've seen in so many places and in so many people, and so reflected in some of the characters in this book, of course. And so I think I learned to sit. And the heart of it is this, I think. You accept that life is a movement between joy and sorrow. It's perhaps the hardest lesson for anyone to learn, to accept. At some point you come out of Eden, you leave the garden, and you're out there in the real world. And so for all of us, I think there needs to be this in some way. But then, of course, there is a kind of, look, let me read you one paragraph from the story with Kiana Rob. Here we were sitting in a car outside the palace, the king's palace, right? The Tonle Sap River, which leads to the Mekong on one side. There were 1 million people that come to Phnom Penh because of, it was the cremation of King Sihanouk. And we were gridlocked. And she was telling the story. She was in the front seat of this car, and she was telling me this, and it was getting translated, and she was telling me this extraordinary story. And where am I now? Oh yeah, here we are. So I sit in the back seat and listen to Narom and Ah intently. The windows are closed and the interior is cooled by air conditioning. Each of us has a role: teller, interpreter, and listener. Story is the currency that unites us, conferring on us a detached intimacy. The milling crowds appear like a supporting cast in a pantomime. There are moments that cut deep in the memory, and this is one of them. All the elements are assembled: the story and the enclosed space in which it is being told, the city so close yet cut off from hearing. The stillness accentuates the melodious flow of Narom's voice. It shifts in energy and the occasional falter. I register each change in tone and expression, the slight shaking of her head in disbelief that such things had happened. I feel the gravity of what she is recalling, acutely aware of my own voice as it breaks the silence with questions. I am suspicious of that voice and fearful of reopening old wounds, fearful of what the telling is doing to the teller, but also possessed by a sense of obligation to hear Narom out. I cannot help but pursue the story. This is it. You're compelled to bear witness, and you kind of, and you've got to be there in that enclosed space to stay with it. And as you may remember, a few pages later, I'm still in that back seat, and she sees me through the rear vision mirror, and she turns around and she says to me,
Yes.
"Are you all right?"
Yes.
Right? And then I knew she had an inner strength. She had the strength. And what was extraordinary about this was, she was then 73 years old. This was the first time she'd ever told this story. And the reason she told it, now we're coming to the heart of the matter. The reason she told me that story, and which she continues telling me that story, as you know, in different places, in different settings in Phnom Penh, because I ran a 3-day writing workshop and came back the next year and the year after to do it with Cambodian writers. And I began that 3-day workshop with a full morning, just talking about my own journey as a writer. And that involves also the stories I've written about my own family's encounter with genocide. And she came up to me at the afternoon break and began telling me that story. And so I think, yes, that's it. In a certain way, I've been there, and she felt she could entrust me with the story. And then, but of course, the gravity of it, you're right. Can you carry it? Can you hold it? And can you do it justice? And I really have to say that doing it justice also involves the light, that light that was there in Kia Narom. She became, as you know, despite losing her entire family to Pol Pot genocide, the Cambodian genocide, she became a children's writer. She became the leading ethnomusicologist in Cambodia. She got a doctorate on the relationship between science and the humanities. She was extraordinary, but she had to work her way through. She had to regain her purpose. So that's the real extraordinary aspect of that story. As it is with Sonia, as it is with William Barrack, the great Wurundjeri elder that Joy led me to his extraordinary story, as it is with these people that came to me to talk about the Cultural Revolution. The Beijing man was a character. He could sit in his little kitchen, in his little apartment, and produce, like a magician, 5-6 course meals, right? And then he's telling me these extraordinary things. That's important. A problem you often see with these sorts of stories is that people forget, hang on, there's joy and there's sorrow in these people's lives. And if I don't see that, then I am doing them a great, once again, I'm not writing about victims. I'm writing about people that I am engaged with, and I'm entering into a relationship with, and I am having a conversation with, and sometimes become an ongoing part of my life, and I integrate it into that, into my own life.
So often you talk about the privilege of being of listening, of being offered these stories. Sometimes it's almost as if it's an offering, a gift to you, even though it's a mixed gift. And I am aware of the time, and I wish we could go on and on. I said, Arnold, before we went online, I said we could go all night, but I don't think anyone else. So just before we go, Nick, just one moment. I just want to say, the Russian poet Maria, so I'm going to get it wrong right now, but I'm not. Svatavia wrote, I don't eavesdrop, I listen attentively, just like a doctor does. The chest. And in your case, Arnold, I extend this to listening to the soul. It feels miraculous, this ability of yours to listen to and to reassemble out of words the dignity of humanity. And I and many others, and I didn't even get to ask you whether you're writing your next book, but we look forward to it. And I just wanted to give a plug also to independent bookstores from where you can get the Watermill. For those who haven't read it, read it. I'm sure you will. I'm sure you need no more encouragement. Thank you so much, Arnold. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Wonderful questions, and we had a conversation. It was very, very, it was an enjoyable experience. Thank you so much, and for the work you put into it. You put so much heart and soul into what you do, Tali. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, both of you. I've been absolutely riveted, and I think, Arnold, you could get stories out of just about anyone. And Arnold, your ability to find the optimism and hope, even when writing about the darkest times, is in a lot of your work. In all your work, is an absolutely inspiration. So just please keep weaving stories in the way that you do. We love it. And before you all go, the audience, can I please just quickly tell you about our next couple of events? Next month, appropriately, just before Pesach, we will be featuring Michael Twitty, the African-American Jewish writer, culinary historian, author of The Cooking Gene and other food-related titles. He's going to be joining us live from New York at 4:30 a.m. his time. So there's really no excuse for you not to make it, is there? If he can do that, surely you can do that too. And in April, I'm particularly excited about the event we're having, not on the second Tuesday, but on the third Tuesday, just for that month. We're going to be presenting our open mic event. And this is an opportunity for you, for all of you, to read a short piece of work to our audience. It can be fiction or non-fiction, memoir or poem. I want to get as many people involved as possible, given time limitations. Links to our submission page and further information were sent out in recent newsletters and will be on our website very soon. So please please start writing, or keep writing, or find something you've written and submit it in the next month or so. And finally, I encourage you to make a donation to Melbourne Jewish Book Week so we can continue to bring you all these great events. Details of how to donate will follow. Thanks again, Arnold and Tali, for a wonderful evening. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next month on Tuesday, 9th of March, with Michael Twitty, interviewed by Alyssa Goldstein. Good evening and keep well and safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.